Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Bettina Bobsien. I'm an equine veterinarian from Vancouver Island. I've been working for the last 2.5 years with the BC SPCA representing animal welfare in the development of the new Equine Code of Practice. And the codes of practice are part of a national program which has been developed for looking at essentially animal care and animal welfare standards for all the farmed species in Canada, including horses. So what we're going to talk about today is just briefly about the SPCA and the work that they do, and NFAC, the National Farm Animal Care Council. And then we're going to talk specifically about a few areas, the contentious areas of the Equine Code. The Equine Code is about a 93-page document. We've got copies up here that you're welcome to help yourself. Horse Council has copies at their booth. I really believe that everybody should have a copy of this to get an idea to ensure that you are meeting the minimum welfare standards for horses in your care, and it will also allow you to update your own knowledge about the latest scientific information about horse keeping, everything from training to housing to euthanasia, career and end-of-life decisions. So it is a really useful piece of work, and we're going to go into today how and why it was developed. Most of you will be familiar, at least glancingly familiar, with the work of the SPCA. The SPCA certainly does lots of sheltering work for dogs and cats in the province and takes care of animal abuse situations, as many of you know. But they're taking a leading role now in developing welfare standards for farmed animals in Canada. And the new codes of practice, they're taking a leading role in that. The SPCA, what many people are not aware is that although they are charged with looking after animal cruelty and as such have special provincial constables that do that work, they receive no government funding. So all of their animal advocacy and shelter work is all done with donated dollars. There are 29 shelters across the province, and they perform a variety of functions beyond just sheltering cats and dogs. All animal cruelty complaints should be addressed to the SPCA, and they actually have a hotline for that. And I know certainly in some of the communities I've worked in, there is a perception amongst horsemen that the SPCA knows little about horses and don't care about horse cruelty cases, and nothing could be further from the truth. In the past, they have been stretched in terms of resources, in terms of dealing with equine cruelty and abandonment and neglect cases. But being a part of this process is bringing them all up to speed as well as to what are the minimum standards. And a big part of the Equine Code has been developing a bottom line for enforcement for use in the courts, but its primary role in many ways is an educational role. So, for example, if there is an investigation of a cruelty complaint, the role of the SPCA initially is to educate, and that's one of the places where this document is going to be so helpful. It's extremely difficult for either a veterinarian or a cruelty investigator to explain horse keeping in Canada 101 on a site visit. So we can provide this document to people that are not caring for their animals properly, or for new horsemen, so they can get off on the right foot and know how to look after their horses properly. We've also had some excellent partnership with Horse Council of BC. They've been wonderfully supportive in terms of providing some support with getting this document out there and getting meetings organized and just whipping up a little bit of interest. So what are the main issues that the SPCA deals with, and what did we really focus on when we first started working on the codes of practice? These are the commonly addressed issues that the SPCA looks at: horses that are too thin or too fat, poor hoof care, lack of veterinary care, general neglect, and occasionally abuse. Canada's codes of practice are now all in the process of being revised, and most of them are finished. There are codes for dairy, beef, cattle, sheep, pigs, poultry is being worked on, and even mink and fox. The way these codes are developed, it's actually a collaborative program with industry. We have a lot of concern from horsemen about who actually wrote the code of practice. And people ask me, well, was that written by somebody down in Vancouver? They don't know about the conditions in Fort St. John. Or was that written by the government in Ottawa? Why should we listen to that? Well, it's not like that at all. The way the NFAC process works is a code committee is assembled of people all across the equine industry. So in our case, we had members of the racing community, we had a feedlot representative, animal welfare, which I did. There was a donkey breeder on the code. There was someone that was an expert in driving. Essentially what we tried to do is we tried to cover all facets of the equine industry so that we could make sure that the code was balanced, fair, and was actually relevant to Canadians and Canadian horses. And the way the codes of practices are framed, we have requirements, and these represent the minimum standards. So if there is an issue of abuse, that would be what the judge would look at, or neglect. This is the minimum standard for caring for your horse in this country. And then we have what we call recommended practices. And the recommended practices are what we are trying to achieve as we improve the welfare and conditions for our horses in this country. These codes will probably be revised every 8 to 10 years, and I think over time, some of those recommended practices will become requirements. Just a photo of the Equine Committee. Now this is just up here to remind you how difficult it is. If you can imagine 18 horse people in a room at once agreeing on a single thing. But now I want you to imagine 18 horse people from all different walks of life living in all different parts of the country, agreeing on things like feeding and agreeing on things like shelter and castration, which we're going to get to. So it was a real challenge. And whenever we really hit the wall, we would have to sit back, take our hands off each other's throats and say, what is going to be best for the horse? And that would be where our decisions would land. So this is just a look at our code committee at work and all of the different groups of horsemen that were represented. So here's a bird's eye view of this incredibly large code, 93 pages of fairly close set writing. I can barely get through it in a night, so I recommend that you tackle it section by section. And in addition to that, we also have several appendices in the rear. The one of them that I found very illuminating was the template budget for horse ownership. And we were constantly pressured to be taking things out of this code because it was too big. But this is probably one of our most difficult areas we face in working in equine welfare or as veterinarians, is people having horses that they can't afford or just simply too many horses. And it was through working on this that we realized that bedding a horse on the South Coast cost as much as buying hay. It was a little bit shocking. So when you get those wide-eyed friends who say, I'd really like to get a horse, pick up a copy of the code and ask them to fill out the budget template, and they may find that they're leasing one or taking riding lessons by the time they finish the math. There's also a little transport decision tree in there, which is governed primarily by CFIA, but nonetheless, the rules of transportation apply not just to slaughter horses going in those big trucks, but they apply to everybody with a horse trailer that's dragging a horse down the road. And there's also quite a detailed look at the body condition scoring chart, which we're going to be talking about a little bit more later. What many of you may not know is there is actually a separate chart for donkeys. So if you have any donkeys in your life, there is a separate body condition scoring chart for them. So the areas I'm going to try to get through today, the high points, are ones regarding shelter, because that's often a hotly debated issue. Snow as a water source, body condition scoring, training and handling, castration, alteration of the tail, responsible breeding, and change or end of career. So this is actually one of my favorite requirements. This is the very first requirement in the code. And if you look at it, we're kind of preaching to the converted here. We probably have many of the top horsemen of the province, both trainers, owners, riders, they're at this conference. But nonetheless, it's a fairly motherhood statement, and that is you must have the resources and knowledge to care for horses for as long as you own them. And although that seems like an obvious statement, unfortunately, it isn't obvious in many of the terrible abuse and neglect situations that we see. And what this essentially means is when the SPCA rolls into your yard and your horses all have a body condition score of 2 and they're standing in 3 feet of snow with no water, saying, I didn't know I couldn't do that, no longer cuts it. Another thing that no longer cuts it is, Doc, I just can't afford to have you float those teeth, or I just can't afford better quality hay. If you own horses in Canada, you are responsible for having the knowledge to care for them and also the resources. If you don't have the resources, then you need to not have the horses. And the other thing that's important in this section is that principal caregivers must be familiar with the code. And a lot of what's in the code is going to appear to be common sense and fairly elementary to many of you, but to first-time horse owners or those people that are neglecting their horses, maybe not. So this is actually a photograph from a farm that is in my practice area, unfortunately, not one of my top flight clients. And I actually had to show this at the code committee meeting because people from back east couldn't understand how you can have 3 feet of mud inside of a shelter. But you can. And the whole place looked like that. There was 30 or 40 horses there of all different genders, stallions, mares, and foals running around together. And that is not acceptable. So I can't talk about all of the issues in the facilities chapter. There's just too much there. But the one that we focused on is mud, simply because mud is such a huge problem, particularly here and in the south, on the south coast. It's also very much a seasonal problem in the prairies. Frequently a few weeks every year at freeze up and at thaw, people will really be battling mud. And we have to accept that that is a part of having horses. But there comes a point where the mud there's just simply too much and it's there for too long. And how does mud badly affect horses? Well, probably anybody that keeps horses on the south coast could teach this section. Essentially, it's a real issue for horses getting around, getting to feed, getting to water, wasting energy getting to feed, but most importantly, can cause some fairly terrible lameness conditions and fairly terrible hoof conditions. So we struggled with this because we're, for example, in areas like Kamloops or in the Caribou, where they will have these short periods where it's very muddy, but they don't really need an overhead shelter. And we actually tried to gun for overhead shelter being a requirement in this part of the country, and we couldn't quite get that wording to work. So where we finally landed was, in muddy conditions, horses must, at minimum, have access to a mud-free, well-drained area in the pasture or yard in which to stand or lie down. And so that provides a workable requirement for people in all parts of the country. Shelter. An incredibly diverse thing, depending on the kind of horses that you have, whether you have very young stock, whether you have geriatrics, whether you have great big fat feedlot horses or thin race horses. And then, of course, there's all of the climatic differences to consider. So what we had to go back to is we had to go back to the basic science on this. And this is where we ended up whenever we got in real trouble. We would go back to our science committee report that told us about all of our priority welfare issues. And we would look at a recommendation based on science. One thing, if you hang around with a bunch of old horsemen, everybody's got a theory. Everybody's got a way their grandpappy did it. And it turns out that a lot of those theories don't really stand up to scientific scrutiny very well. So going back to the animal behavior scientists and the basic science was really useful whenever we got into trouble. And so the concept of shelter, you really have to look at what is thermoneutral for horse. And for horses, a thermoneutral zone, and that's essentially the temperature at which a horse feels absolutely comfortable wearing no clothing, is somewhere between 5 and 20 degrees. And in people, it's around 20 degrees. So that's your typical Hawaiian vacation where you can sit around in a bathing suit and feel perfectly fine. For our horses, it's quite a bit bigger range. So even though it may be 6 degrees out here and we might feel a little bit chilly and feel like winter's coming, that horse is actually perfectly happy. He's not actually expending any calories at all in the thermoneutral zone, either trying to stay warm or trying to stay cool. Now that is quite variable. It changes very much based on whether or not a horse is too thin, whether or not the coat is wet and it's raining, and whether or not it's windy. But it gives us a bit of a framework from where to decide that a horse actually needs shelter. And certainly in many places in BC, there's a good portion of the year where the horses are actually thermoneutral. So they really don't need very much shelter as long as the temperatures are within that thermoneutral zone. So once again, how can you write a rule for Langley that's going to apply in Kamloops and is going to apply in Saskatoon or in Ottawa? So we had to approach this problem by taking an outcome-based approach, and that is, how do we decide when an animal needs shelter? And we're going to decide that based on how the horse is doing. So the code requirement is that horses must have shelter, either constructed or natural, that protects them from the harmful effects of extreme weather conditions. So if it's normally -10 in your part of the country, and your horses huddle up around the round bale and they do fine because they've got complete access to hay, great winter coats, and they're not shivering and they're not having any difficulty with the cold, that's just fine. But when it gets to -25 and it's a blizzard and your horses are no longer feeding properly because they're so cold and they're actively shivering, you are required to take action at that point. And also, we have to address individual animals. What works for a healthy, slightly comfortably overweight quarter horse with a body condition score of 7 out of 9 is quite different from a debilitated yearling that's, for example, at the bottom of the pecking order. So those horses would fall under this protection, and that is you must promptly assist individual horses that are showing signs of heat or cold stress. Snow is a water source. This was a very, very interesting topic around the table because there is almost no science on this, and the people are so divided on this issue. Anyone that was at the talk earlier, listening to our great nutritionist from Otter Co-op, Ken Wilkinson, he stressed over and over again how important water is to horses. But there are many horses that are simply left to fend for themselves, for example, in northern BC and northern Saskatchewan. And people think this is all right because a fair number of those horses actually survive the winter. This became a real problem because there's almost no science on this. And we know that horses drink about 25 liters on average of water a day. Well, if you do the simple math with snow, that means a horse would have to eat 250 liters of snow in a day. If a horse ate snow all day long, there's no way he could meet that water requirement simply from a standpoint of a time budget, but certainly from an energy budget, there would be no way either. So we know that horses that are relying on snow are not drinking enough water. And when we were challenged by the science committee, because they said, there really is no good science on this, it's because nobody would allow you to run an experiment on water deprivation on horses because it would be judged to be cruel. So it's a little bit of a catch-22. So we ended up having to simply go back to sort of common sense and what we know about horses. I mean, the things you have to consider that a horse will suffer from if it is deprived of water and is required to eat snow is dehydration, weight loss, just discomfort from thirst, and a much higher risk of impaction colics. And the other thing the other great flaw in the argument of the snow-only system is how do you control the weather? Any of you that have ever lived near Calgary will understand how you can get a Chinook blowing through and suddenly this loose, fluffy snow that the horses were relying on is covered by 3 inches of ice. So the horses can't move around and they certainly can't access any reasonable quantity of snow. So where we ended up was that horses must have access to safe, palatable, and clean water in quantities to maintain health and vigor. And there are people that are going to manage with snow-only systems if they're using things like high moisture forages, like haylage, for example. If your horse is in an area where he has a lot of access to green browse underneath snow, he might be able to manage. But we really have come to the conclusion that hay plus snow is completely inadequate. And we will see how that is going to stand the scrutiny of the lawyers and the judges. But what we think happens to horses that are living on a snow-only system is that they're essentially surviving, and they're basically waiting for the weather to improve enough that they can go back to eating normally and return to a normal hydration status. Horses are capable of starvation for reasonably long periods, relying just on coal and water, but that must be quite a miserable thing for them to endure. And just what other areas of regulation in terms of requirements is that in extreme weather conditions, you must pay special attention to water availability, and that applies both hot and cold conditions. Body condition scoring. This is probably something that many of you are very familiar with. Good horsemen will be body condition scoring their horses all the time. We've relied quite heavily on body condition scoring because it's a really important tool for enforcement personnel and veterinarians to communicate. So I can talk to an enforcement person in Fort St. John, and if they tell me they've got a horse that's a body condition score of 2, I got a pretty good idea of what they're talking about versus, oh, doc, you should see him, it's pathetic, he's really, really thin. Just a couple of examples of extremely low body condition scores. That horse on the left there, the chestnut horse, that horse's body condition score of 1 was euthanized as being in critical distress. The really sad part of that picture is you see there's a little flower on its wither. That was left there by the RCMP officer that accompanied the SPCA inspectors. The horse in the Appaloosa horse, that's probably a body condition score of likely a 2. So where does the code feel your horse's body condition score should be? Ideally somewhere between a 4 and a 6, and provides lots of information and recommendations on corrective action that should be taken for horses that are outside of the body condition scoring of 4 to 6. And we've actually made some very specific requirements with regard to thin horses. And that's because thin horses are such a huge and recurrent problem. So if you have a horse, for example, with a body condition score of 3, you must take corrective action. And that corrective action means providing more feed, providing different feed, calling your veterinarian, exploring other health problems or issues the horse may be having, access to water, for example. If after taking corrective action, your horse's condition doesn't improve and it drops to a 2, you must call a veterinarian, and that is a requirement. So that makes life a lot easier for our special provincial constables because they can go out to a farm with a bunch of thin horses and they can say, okay, these horses, half of these are 3 and half of these are 2s. What have you done about it? And it gives them that hard line in the sand rather than going back at once a week or once every 2 weeks and just have the conditions not get any better. What do we do about horses that are emaciated, a body condition score of 1 or 2, that don't respond to veterinary intervention? As horsemen, we really need to think about euthanizing those horses. Old age itself is not a cause for disease. And one of the things that we battle with a lot is, a doc, he ain't skinny, he's just old. Well, we know now that old horses get skinny, usually because their teeth are failing, usually because they've got immune system problems and are having problems with things like parasites or other infections, or they have some serious systemic disease. I was interested to sitting around the code table. There were a fair number of folks from the prairies there that were maybe a little hard-nosed, a little more hard-nosed than some of us folks out west. But they said, you know, the other thing as horsemen we need to be doing is when we get these chronically emaciated horses that resist all our efforts to get more weight on them, we really should be considering euthanasia. I have a lot of clients that, you know, have horses in their 30s and 40s that really do become skeletons in the end. And I think we sometimes want to keep them going just because they're such a big part of our history and our family's history. But these animals eventually do ultimately starve to death. So, you know, it's something we need to be thinking about as knowledgeable horsemen, is when to quit. Handling and training. This is another super interesting section. Can you imagine having all those people from all those different disciplines arguing about how to best handle and train horses, including people there from the feedlot and from the rodeo sector who have horses that are never even halter broke? So what are we going to do about this? How are we going to come up with something we can all live with? And even here, you know, we've got some of the top trainers in the country, and they might have very different ideas about how you handle certain things and certain situations. So we decided the best way to tackle this is to go back to basic principles of animal handling and go to some of the newest behavioral science. If you train horses, if you train your own horses, if you train other people's horses, if you're employing a horse trainer, I strongly encourage you to take a look at this section. There is some really fascinating new information in there about how horses learn. And if you're ever dealing with a new trainer, and you know, sometimes as horsemen, you know, there's the new flavor of the month horse trainer around, and we're all thinking that this is the latest, greatest thing. Anybody that's training horses effectively, their methods should always match with the current understood behaving principles of animal behavior and animal training. So if you have a question about a horse trainer and you're wondering about their methods, take a look at those basic principles and make sure that those trainers are meeting those principles. And one of the simplest ones actually is, how do you handle loose horses? What is the point of balance? How do horses see? And some of this stuff in this code can be quite interesting even to people that have a lot of experience training and handling horses. So where are we at the requirements again? Where does the rubber really meet the road as far as horse training goes? Well, there's some fairly good requirements here with some fair strength, and that is handlers must be familiar with equine behavior and competent in humane handling techniques, either through training, experience, or mentorship. So that means if you're a horse trainer, you actually have to know what you're doing, which is kind of a shocking statement. It's basic, but it's obviously true. The other thing is that horses must be handled in a manner that does not subject them to avoidable pain and avoidable injury. Now, this is a very carefully worded statement, because there would be some that would say that a horse should never be subjected to pain in its training. And in principle, we all agree with that. But the picture that I showed you about that horse, with the horse that was standing in the 3 feet of mud, that is the first place I've ever used a twitch, which for those of you that don't know what it is, which is an axe handle with a rope drilled through it. I had to use a twitch on a horse to get out of one of those pens, and that's because the horse was chasing me down. So I had to inflict pain on that horse to save myself. It was avoidable pain. All the horse had to do was stop chasing me with its mouth open and its ears back. There are times where we have to use some degree of corporal punishment on horses. They're big animals, they're dangerous animals, and part of their ethos, or part of how horses interact with each other, is through some degree of physical harm to each other. But it needs to be avoided, and we never want to put our horses in a situation where they have no way out, where they can't escape from a painful situation. So why was horse training so important to the SPCA? There's some really good information out there that poorly trained, badly behaved horses tend to have poor welfare through their whole life. And I think we've all seen this. You know, the horse that's had 10 homes in 10 years. So we really all owe our horses a good basic education, because if you don't provide your horse with a good basic education, he is at really serious risk of having poor welfare. Also, horses must only undergo training that matches their physical capabilities and levels of maturity. Another obvious motherhood statement, but if it isn't there, okay, you can't enforce it. And thirdly, that all equipment used on horses must be maintained in good repair and must also fit the horse correctly. Equine castration, a difficult and contentious issue in Canada. I, as a practicing veterinarian, thought, and many of the horsemen that I talked to thought, that horse castration was pretty much only performed by veterinarians in Canada. And just out of interest, how many people in this audience are familiar with horses being castrated by laymen or cowboys? No, old cowboy, okay. Most people that I talked to thought that this practice was dying out with the old cowboys. And when I went to vet school, they pretty much said, you know, how do you castrate a horse without a veterinarian? You get 2 cowboys, a fifth of whiskey, and a sharp knife. And as people get more educated and understanding more about equine welfare, we kind of assumed that those days were over. Well, unfortunately, it turns out that that's not true. And in Canada, there's somewhere between 2,000 and 6,000 horses that are castrated every year with no anesthetic, no analgesia at all. And some of them are young, some of them are foals, but many of them are somewhere between 5 months and 2 years old. And the question is how and why is this happening? The Canadian Veterinary Medical Association has a very strong statement about equine castration, saying that it's a veterinary-only procedure. Why? Well, first of all, it's painful. And I would challenge anybody in this room, male or female, to argue that castration is not painful. Secondly, it's high risk. It's one of the highest risk procedures that's performed day to day by veterinarians. It has a complication rate of about 10%. Now that is wildly higher than any spay-neuter sort of procedure that you'll see in small animals. And the risk of complications can be quite serious. Things like hemorrhage, things like the animal's intestines basically coming out the hole. And in much of Canada, it is absolutely a veterinary-only procedure, and it's controlled by the provincial veterinary associations, and that is the case in British Columbia, fortunately. So it is illegal to castrate a horse in British Columbia unless you are a veterinarian, and that assumes that you're using proper pain control. However, in the provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan, it's specifically exempted from the Veterinary Act. So if you pull up the Veterinary Act, it says that laymen are allowed to castrate their own animals, including horses. Now, around the Code Committee table, we found this absolutely unacceptable. And it's gradually becoming unacceptable to castrate any animal in Canada without some pain control. Even beef cattle now have a pain control requirement. So how are we going to address this? We can take the Canadian Veterinary Medical Association's position on this, and we can say that only horse castration can only be performed by veterinarians. And we thought if we did that, absolutely nothing would change, because it's been that way for years, and nothing's happening and no one's moving. So what we decided to try to start to get these producers in Alberta and Saskatchewan on the bus. And sometimes when you're dealing in animal welfare, you have to take baby steps first. So for them, the first baby step is for them to actually admit that castration is painful. And if we can get them to do that, we can get them to provide some pain control. How did we land up with these requirements? Well, first of all, there's certain classes of horses that should only be castrated by a veterinarian. And that means castration of mature horses, anything over 2 years old, and castration of donkeys and mules. The reason is all 3 of these classes of horses are at a much, much higher risk of serious or fatal complications. Number 2, any horse with a retained testicle has to be castrated by a veterinarian, and you have to follow your provincial regulations. So that's the first sort of set of rules. The second set of rules is, if you are in one of those provinces, you absolutely must provide some pain control. And folks that are doing this themselves can't do anesthetic in terms of like a general anesthetic. They can't actually do sedation because of risks and regulations. But what they can do is they can provide some local anesthetic, and they can also provide some non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, things like phenylbutazone and banamine, to help these horses out. And to do that, they have to have a working relationship with a veterinarian. The veterinarian would provide them with the drugs only if the veterinarian was comfortable that they were doing it properly, that the restraint was appropriate, and that the veterinarian is there for backup to deal with any of the animals that can't be castrated by them because of things like retained testicles, or if they really run into trouble with a particular animal. And you might ask the question, how do they do this? The way they do this is they do this with the squeeze tables that they're using to trim the rough stock. Rough stock are horses that are not trained to halter. So essentially these animals are on a squeeze tilt table where they trim their feet and they do the castration at the same time. So roping them down and tying them up is generally not considered safe and humane restraint. So you really do have to provide safe and humane restraint if you're forced to do it this way. Do I think it should be done this way? No. I don't think it's in the best interest of the horses, but this is where we are now. I think we need to move forward with this to try to make this a veterinary-only procedure down the road, but sometimes big change takes time. Tail alterations. Another very interesting area, another little area of sort of closet badness in the horse world. And I think many of us are familiar with the tail docking in draft horses. Tail docking for cosmetic purposes in draft horses, as of the release of this code, is no longer allowed. The nicking of saddlebred tails, putting them into these tail braces to make their tails stick straight up, also no longer allowed. Those are the real public ones, and those are the ones it's easy to get people on board. The much more insidious one is the tail blocking. And the tail blocking is unfortunately a procedure that is done by typically by the hunter crowd and by certain segments of the quarter horse crowd. And this is the injection of alcohol into the nerves at the root of the tail to essentially paralyze the horse's tail. It is, if you ask me, it is a mutilation. Those horses can be deprived of the use of their tail for the rest of their life. Horse uses its tail to lift it, to get out of the way of manure. It uses it to express emotion, and it, probably most importantly to that horse, it uses it to swish flies. From time to time, like any medical, in quotation marks, procedures, these procedures can go wrong. And this was a very high value quarter horse that had an unfortunate reaction to the alcohol, and it's a little bit difficult to see in here because of the light, but you can see the braided tail, a beautifully braided tail, probably with a tail extension, and you can see that horse is essentially sloughing all of its skin and its meat from its hindquarter. And people that don't travel in these circles might ask, why would anyone do this to a horse? The reason people do this is they do this to win competitively, and it's to give the horse the impression, or to give the judge the impression, of absolutely robotic compliance on the part of a horse. So it's apparently at some point in horse show history, it was decided that a horse flicking its tail after landing a big fence in a hunter round was incorrect or unattractive in some way. And it's really sad that it's come to that. I can say that in the hunter world there is some move away from this robotic compliance. I think we're still working on that in the quarter horse crowd. Responsible breeding. Fortunately, the only good that came of the economic crash of 2008 for the horse industry was the absolute drastic reduction in horse breeding. And many estimates is that horse breeding after 2008 dropped in certain areas of Canada by over 90%. And that's probably a good thing. There's thousands and thousands of horses that are ending up at the slaughterhouse every year because of overbreeding and horse oversupply. So what can we do about horse breeding? If we can just breed sensibly, if we cannot breed unsound, lame, useless horses, okay, we can end a lot of welfare problems before they start. Breed only if you have a plan. Breed only horses that have a known market or purpose. Please don't breed those 8-year-old mares that you could never do anything useful with, so we might as well see what her foal might be like. The best predictor of future performance is past performance, and horses that have soundness, behavioral, or training problems, there's a reasonable chance that their offspring will too. So here's the code requirement. This one's shocking to me. And that is, do not breed horses unless you are familiar with and able to provide the basics of care as outlined in the codes for both mares, genets, and foals. So essentially what that means is unless you are in compliance with all 93 pages of this document, you are technically not allowed to breed a horse in this country. Now, that's a pretty powerful statement, okay? We don't have those rules for people. But what this will hopefully do is this will hopefully put our enforcement people in a proactive situation. And we've all seen this stuff. There's 3 or 4 pregnant mares in a mud hole with a twisted barbed wire fence and no shelter, and it's March. And we know those mares are going to foal. And nobody can do anything until those foals are actually born in a mud puddle, septicemic, and dying, and these people haven't called the vet. So this is a powerful statement. I'm curious as to how and when it will ever stand up in a court of law. But so often, if you've got the requirement and you go to people and you present it to them, okay, maybe we can get people to take action before they find themselves in a disastrous situation. Change or end of career. This is another area that's a real sore point for many veterinarians, for many horse trainers, for many people in the community, and that is the whole issue around what happens to horses when we're done with them. And the requirement is the welfare of the horse must be of paramount importance when making change or end of career decisions. And this is critical. It's not okay, all right, as horsemen, it's not okay for us to take a horse that we know is no longer sound to do the job we're asking it to do, get a veterinarian out to inject all its joints, and sell it to the next person who thinks that they're going to do the same thing. Okay, that's not fair. That's not fair to the horse. It's not fair to the buyer. It's not okay to take a crippled, tired old riding school horse or pack horse and take it down to the auction where you might get $200 for it, and then it's going to ride the long truck all the way to Saskatchewan. It's going to stand in a feedlot for 6 months with its arthritis, its laminitis, you fill in the blank, while it goes through a mandatory washout period before it goes for slaughter. That's really not okay. We need to really step up to the plate as horsemen to start making better decisions for horses at the end of their career or, unfortunately, at the end of their lives. And if that means paying the money to have the veterinarian come out, paying the money to have the renderer come out and put those horses down where they stand and have them hauled away or buried or cremated, that's what we need to do. We need to stop passing horses off onto the next unsuspecting person. And a great case that I'll bring up is the case of that horse that many of you may have heard of in Victoria that was hung by the backhoe. And what happened in that case was it was a family, and maybe they're here today, I don't know, but they had the standard 25-year-old horse that had no teeth, and a 25-year-old horse with no teeth in Victoria costs about $500 a month to feed. What they did with this horse is they were tired of dealing with it. They wanted to move on in their lives, so they found someone that was willing to take it for free, free to good home old horse. So they gave it to a crusty old Dutch farmer who put it out in a field. And so very quickly this horse, without the benefit of all of this processed food and special care that it was getting, was becoming progressively more emaciated. All kinds of people tried to intervene. This old fellow wouldn't listen to reason. One veterinarian actually offered to euthanize the horse for free. He wouldn't hear of it. He got tired of the SPCA showing up at his place. So he took his backhoe one day, tied a rope around the horse's neck, and he hung it. And that was his method of euthanasia. And if you understand anything about the anatomy of the horse, a horse's larynx and its trachea are reasonably difficult to crush. So the reality is that horse probably asphyxiated. So basically it died by choking. And this came up around the table at the Code Committee because when we made the euthanasia requirements, I was absolutely adamant that it had to be in there that there's only 3 ways you're allowed to kill a horse in Canada. One of them is lethal injection by a veterinarian, one of them is gunshot, and the third one is captive bolt. And it had to be in that document, that is the only way. And they said, for heaven's sakes, Bettina, who would even dream of trying to kill a horse any other way? I said, aha, how about hanging? And so it is in there. Because the way that the fellow got off on that case, like he got a wrist slapping, and is that nobody could really prove that that horse suffered. So now with the code, it would be a slam dunk. But that was unacceptable. Well, why is that? Why am I talking about that horse, about change and end of career? The people I think we should be talking to are the people that own that 25-year-old horse. They should have put that horse down. Okay, they should have let that horse go peacefully. Okay, there is no bad welfare associated with a timely euthanasia, but there is terrible welfare associated with passing off geriatric horses with multiple health problems to people that simply don't have the means or the ability or the knowledge to care for them.